Hi, my name is Andrew Ledovskikh, and I'm a senior industry analyst at IBISWorld. Today, I'm just going to be briefly talking about the funeral directors, crematoria, and cemeteries industry, and the sort of strange oligopoly that's formed there. It's not the sort of oligopoly we're used to, the Woolworths and Coles, where you have these two major retail chains, and people are aware of it, and they talk about it, and they make their decisions about their shopping habits kind of around the nature of that oligopoly and their awareness of that oligopoly. In the funeral directors, cemeteries, and crematoria industry, the oligopoly that's formed has really been won by stealth. It's been formed over time and through a series of acquisitions by the two major players, InvoCare and Propel Partners. It doesn't have the same sort of market share as Woolworths and Coles, but they still dominate around 40% of the industry in this really fragmented funeral homes, kind of funeral director industry. So the way that this oligopoly is formed has really not been through kind of these big acquisitions or, for example, just all in one shot. It's been formed over many years through a ton of really small acquisitions. Sometimes these companies have acquired chains, sometimes they've acquired even just single establishment funeral homes, and they've kind of integrated them into their brand. And they've integrated them into their brand in a way that I guess isn't really commonly understood. When Woolworths or Coles, for example, buys a property or a supermarket, they kind of tear down all the branding, they change it to make it look like a Woolworths and Coles store, and then they operate it. The way that InvoCare and Propel Partners have done it is they've acquired these dozens of statewide, national, and individual brands across Australia and New Zealand over time, and they've largely kept the original branding of those companies. And what that means is, firstly, it's led to some issues with the ACCC, which has fined Propel Funeral Partners, for example, for two of their funeral homes advertising themselves still as family-owned and locally owned, even though they were now owned by this major multinational conglomerate. But it can also make it really hard for consumers to really understand the situation they are in and negotiate effectively. A consumer might go to multiple different funeral homes and funeral directors thinking they're getting multiple quotes and negotiating with all these different companies to try to get the best deal, not realizing that they might be dealing with the same company that has the same pricing strategies and the same sort of market control. Before I get into, I guess, the more traditional, how does an oligopoly affect a consumer, largely around price and negotiating power, I do want to talk about some of the specific issues for consumers in this industry. It's not just your weekly grocery shop or your phone bill or where you go to bank. Consumers who are getting funeral director services are in this kind of really unique position. Firstly, they're likely dealing with a service that they are not at all familiar with and do not engage with on a day-to-day basis. Bereavement and death in a family doesn't happen that often. And so for many people who engage with funeral directors, cemeteries, and crematoria, it might be the first time that they've done it, or the first time they've done it in many, many years. The second thing is that a funeral service is really a time-sensitive thing. We don't have a lot of time to set it up. And so there's a lot of time pressure on these consumers. The third thing is that consumers are often generally not in the sort of a really kind of stable emotional state because they're dealing with a bereavement. So you have all of these factors that are really reducing the negotiating power and the ability of consumers to really understand the process that they're going through and making sure that they get a good deal. And then you add on top of that this additional asymmetry, this additional lack of understanding of the nature of the brands that they're dealing with, that maybe those brands are all owned by the same company, maybe they're negotiating with the same company multiple times, and they're not actually getting legitimately different quotes from different companies. So all of that tends to really harm the negotiating power and the deals and the prices that consumers can get. And we can see that play out in broader pricing data. So when we take a look at industry prices as recorded by the ABS through the Producer Price Index compared to CPI, we can see that basically until the pandemic, prices for funeral services, cemeteries, interments, and cremations has consistently outpaced the Consumer Price Index and inflation. So prices have gone up far faster than general inflation. That changed slightly at the beginning of the pandemic, both because there were some controls around the sorts of funeral activities you could engage in, and that impacted demand, and saw some funeral directors cut their prices to compete for a more limited set of services that were being sold, but also with increased ACCC scrutiny. However, that gap has started to grow again. In the last 3 years, in 2023, 24, 25, we've seen the prices have started to outpace inflation consistently again in the aftermath of the pandemic. And again, we're seeing consumers pay higher prices than they might otherwise do if we kind of had less market power from some of these major players. That's not to say that the oligopoly is the main driver of these price increases. There's lots of reasons that consumers are not well equipped to kind of make sure that they get the best deal when they kind of engage a funeral director. And that might happen either with an oligopoly or a major firm, or that might happen with an individual funeral director or operator. But at the same time, the oligopoly in the funeral directors, cemeteries, and crematoria industry kind of adds additional complications to what's already a difficult situation for consumers. Thank you very much for your time. I hope that was informative.